You're saying that humans need fantasies to make life bearable?
No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
With tooth fairies, hogfathers.
Yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies.
So we can believe the big ones?
Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing.
They're not the same at all.
You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, you try to act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged.
But people have got to believe that. What's the point?
You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become?
Imagine you're imprisoned in a hellish, false reality, ruled by brutish, supreme beings that feed on your very essence. You're never sure of who you really are, forever cast in foggy reincarnations that only serve to fuel your forgetfulness and anxiety. You have a very small chance of remembering who you are, a spark of hope. And if that happens, then the brunt of the universe will come down at you because your very awakening is a cosmic rebellion. Even if you overcome the wrath of ruling angels, it's a long ascent through endless heavens of demonic gatekeepers and false paradises towards an eternal light you know is your true home. And maybe, just maybe, you'll reach that eternal light and feel some sort of peace, a little authenticity. That's the good news, the Gnostic news. What's the bad news? That everything I said is wrong, and our universe is controlled by some divine providence, and everything is just hunky-dory, part of a holy plan, as you can see by looking out the bedroom window and the window of your soul. Or perhaps that is just randomness, and we're biological robots, as Alex says mockingly on Skeptico. Happy accidents in a meaningless universe, as Richard Dawkins said. Woohoo!
The only true God, the only real God, is the God of meat.
Bad news, I say, because at least in the Gnostic alternative, you might not have much of a chance, but this chance truly makes you a unique and worthy hero and crystallizes why you always felt this existence was more like bad software. That madness and not randomness or prudence was behind the whole of creation. Reminds me of this quote by Christopher Morley. My theology, briefly, is that the universe was dictated but not signed.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Best of all, once you know the truth, you can change the narrative because you realize it's all just a story told by a demented creator god, an idiot full of sound and fury. As Berger Pearson said in his book Ancient Gnosticism, the goal of the Gnostic is to be saved from the cosmic prison in which it now exists, and to be restored to the realm of light from which the true human self originated. Gnosis provides the means for achieving this and ensuring the passage of the soul back to God.
I want to live a real life. I don't want to dream any longer.
And remember, Gnostic texts are dark and grim and gritty, but actually very positive. Because the message is that everything is going to be alright in the end, if you've got Sophia at your side.
You, no trouble. Me, fifth element. Supreme being.
So welcome to finding that eternal light that is your true self and being the hero you were always destined to be, if you so choose. Welcome to Aeon by Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, always through the God Above God.cam. I'm infernally glad you have arrived and hope to be once again at your service. Keep you company as some benevolent Charon in your journey of theosis and clear-minded theodicy. My name is Miguel Connor, your host of Lord of Hosts, sometimes taking the moniker of Abraxas, the supreme reality of Basilides and Jung, and almost the patron god of chaos magic. But Pete Carroll decided to go with Baphomet. So Abraxas ended up being the Sanders to Baphomet's Clinton, it seems. Regardless, we are all gods here. Or more like higher than the gods, as is attested in the Gnostic apocalypse of Adam.
I'm sorry? What was that again?
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god. I'm not the god. I don't think.
You will soon discover all of this and more on this show, my true secret warriors, because our astral guest is truly aeonic, an inspiration in so many ways, and an individual who walks all the good walks. On this September, the year of our Demiurge 2017, we are joined by David Parry, a true Renaissance man and modern Gnostic. David is a playwright, poet, liberal Catholic priest, Wiccan priest, anarchist, elegant mystic, and all-around kind-hearted fellow. He brings his Sophia to the virtual Alexandria to discuss another sophisticated mystic, the Gnostic sage and poet theologian, Valentinus himself. Not only Valentinus and his ideas, but how Valentinus is actually making a comeback, and Christian denominations are beginning to accept his visionary ideas almost 2,000 years after he was branded a heretic. Truly remarkable.
I'm prophetic, not infallible.
We will also discuss Old Catholic theology, sacred theater, Jungian Gnosis and alchemy, and how to achieve altered states of mind, and much, much more. It's verily both an educational and inspirational interview. I know you won't forget. I know will remind you that you can be the hero that stands tall at the end of the Gnostic reality and before that eternal light. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is.
I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change.
And the Gnostic narrative is an amazing journey of self-discovery, of your divine self, of who you were before they made you forget and told you it was a kind universe or meaningless machine. As Jungian scholar June Singer said in her work, A Gnostic Book of Hours, it serves no purpose to conceal who we are or what we know. Knowing ourselves and being willing to stand for who we are makes life authentic. If we can do this, then we can move freely through life because there is no dissonance between our sense of our own nature and the way we behave.
See, it's no good, Monty. We've all got to be alike. The only way to be happy is for everyone to be made equal.
To summarize all of this, let me quote from a poem by Gnostic Bishop Rosamunde Miller, an individual who certainly harnesses the tragic beauty and transcendence of the theology of Valentinus. Here it is. I have been apart and I have lost my way. The archons have taken my vision. At times I am filled with thee, but often I am blind to thy presence, when all I see is this world of form. My ignorance and blindness are all I have to offer, but these I give to thee, holding back nothing. And in my hours of darkness, when I am not sure there even is a thou, hearing my call, I still call thee with all my heart. Hear the cry of my voice clamoring from this desert, for my soul is parched and my heart can barely stand this longing. Led us to an unforgettable, immersive interview with David Parry.
We are all guilty of war and death. Always. In the same way, we can all be guilty of peace. Always. I ask this of you on bended knee. I'm ready to die for you, if only you will become guilty of peace. I always say to the children who write me from all over the world, think about all the things you like. That is God. Children like all sorts of things, but none of them have ever written that what they like is war. And remember what Saint Augustine said. If you want to see God, you have the means to do it. God is love. I, on the other hand, won't speak to you about God until there's peace. Because God is peace. And peace is God. Give me peace, and I'll give you God.
This is the AM Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having David Parry. How are you doing today, David?
I'm doing relatively well for being someone incarcerated in Britain, and it's a great pleasure to be on this show. I've heard great things about it from mutual friends of ours, and I'm deeply honored.
The pleasure is all ours, and so is the honor, especially when we have such a wonderful array of guests like yourself. And with us, and glad to be back, we have our wingman, the moondog himself, Vance. How are you doing today, Vance? Are you incarcerated in California?
Well, you might say. Doing pretty good, but my wings are a little bit clipped these days.
So it happens, such is life. But anyway, David, why don't we start with you? Well, of course we're going to start with you, but tell us, reading some of your interviews, you are referred to as a pagan. Tell us a little bit about your life and how you came into the occult / esoteric / heretical circles.
Firstly, I don't see how anybody could be incarcerated in California. I would truly love to live there. But that's me being a bitter, twisted Londoner, of course. Oh, gosh. I mean, it's a very, very, very long story. I started out, the common denominator, let's take that from a different direction. The common denominator in my life has always been professional ministry. I was leading up to ministry and was in charge of a number of Unitarian churches. At that time, there was no Unitarian Universalism in Britain in any recognizable form. For a number of years, I went through a Congregationalist church. I was the minister for that church for a number of years. And then leading up to ministry with the Metropolitan Community Church. My background theologically was a split between Anglo-Catholicism. My mother was Anglo-Catholic. My stepfather was Roman Catholic. So there was a very magical. I think it's wrong to hide the fact that those are magical traditions. You know, there was a sacramental, magical view of life, the universe, which I realized was highly authentic. In so-called low church, I felt that was missing. Recently, I was consecrated in Italy, in a secret monastery in Italy, as a Valentinian Gnostic bishop, in recognition for my years of service as a minister, and also the fact I've been something of a diehard Gnostic from year dot. And recently, the old Catholic, the liberal Catholic Church of Antioch has decided to honor that and welcome me in as a priest and bishop in their own right. So I will be that curious beast, a Catholic with a Gnostic theology, and openly so. During that time, I felt it was my duty as someone who truly embodied the Gnostic message. You know, belief systems are belief systems, and they're good things and they're beautiful things 9 times out of 10. But that is the beginning of the journey. That's not the end of the journey. To swallow a group of ideas, never think about them, never test them, never explore them, I think is terrible, a terrible indictment on not only an individual person, but the mainstream churches themselves for encouraging that. So I went searching, and it will all be in my next book. I went searching for ancestors and spent a couple of years wrestling with heathenry, which is a very, very mixed bag of sort of traditional North European pagan practices. Freya Aspen, a very, very good friend of mine, initiated me into the rites of Godi, which would be their equivalent of a priest, of course. I'm also something of an initiated Wiccan. I went looking for the female side of God, the Sophia, at one point. And again, they taught me that there is a great validity, a great authenticity to those mysteries and that path. But all roads lead maybe not to Rome, but certainly Antioch. So I came back to the liberal Catholic tradition, strengthened, empowered, and understanding what neo-paganism was really about. To my mind, neo-paganism in Europe, I don't like speaking about conditions and contexts outside of Europe. I don't know them well enough. But that's the Hinduism of Europe. And I'm grateful for the lessons they taught me. And as I say, I found that journey personally, spiritually enriching. It was a Gnostic's journey looking for Gnostic's truth. And I was blessed with finding certain great truths along those lines. I hope that's something of an answer.
That's a great answer, David. And you said you were made into a Valentinian priest. Is this from the tradition of Daniel, the French occult tradition, or tell the audience a little bit more about that?
Oh, you naughty man. There is an Italian Valentinian tradition. I'm a Jungian. I love the works of Jung. I'm a regular attender, an official friend of Jung Club London. And it doesn't mean I buy into all of it. I mean, there was a guy called Carus, I believe he was before Freud and Jung, who said, look, there's actually a universal unconsciousness, which is an incredible thought. Certainly even Jung only went as far as a collective unconscious, which of course is our species consciousness. So I find that mixture of scientific inquiry and religious / spiritual reflection very, very helpful. I was dialoguing with the Italians for nigh on 20 years. I'll be honest, I didn't believe they were who they said they were. I thought, Valentinianism, maybe particularly in Italy, has well and truly been trounced. So we had a very long and thoughtful, prayerful discussion for a number of years. And, eventually push came to shove. And I said, well, look, documents, I'm no historian, but I've got to see some documents. And they sent me some documents, and they looked pretty valid to me. So after a great deal of prayer and reflection, and indeed talking about the whole experience with Jung Club London, who were very supportive, they said, well, it looks genuine, let's see what happens. I went across to, as I say, a private monastery in Italy. I don't think I'm really at liberty to mention names, if you'll forgive me, because they've all got quite paranoid since this spectacular ceremony of ordination and consecration took place. I'll give you a clue. At midnight, one particular night, as the preliminary rituals were beginning, I found myself parading around private grounds as people were chanting incantations into a cave that was candlelit, giving it the impression of looking quite infinite. A most beautiful, beautiful area of Italy. The consecration took the entire weekend. They got very, very nervous because some of them were actually employed with the Roman Catholic Church. And when I got back to London with my diplomas and what have you, they said, well, we really want to pull back immediately. You're bishop to London, do what you want to do, but you want no further contact. To my sadness, I found out I was on my own, which is one of the reasons I think sort of joining and melding with the Church of Antioch, whereby the apparatus is in place, but I can pursue Gnosticism, seems to me the perfect marriage. So, is it allied to the French line? Yes. I don't really feel, and you'll forgive me, that I can mention Italian names, some of whom would be well known to you, and some of whom would be instantaneously recognizable through their books, through their articles. One of whom is very, very famous and on the circuit at the moment. But as I say, I rather feel I'd let the side down if I mention names directly.
No worries at all. This is very interesting. And of course, the audience is probably going to be very happy that there is an extra dimension to these Gnostic churches. Vance, you got a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the liberal Catholic tradition. This is something that I hadn't heard. I was raised Catholic. And by the way, my ancestors, one of my ancestors is Faustus Socinus. You know who that is?
Yeah.
Yeah. My last name is Socci, S-O-C-C-I, and that comes from Socinus and so forth. So I kind of was born with an interest in this stuff. What could you tell us about the liberal Catholic tradition? It's fascinating.
Well, I mean, liberal Catholic is another way of saying old Catholic. The old Catholics are the churches, the group. I mean, it's like Protestantism. There's no such thing as Protestantism. There are many, many different churches with related ideologies, with related theologies. It's exactly the same with the Catholic tradition. The old Catholics, mostly in Utrecht a couple of hundred years ago, felt they couldn't really go along the lines of papal infallibility. They felt maybe a council could speak infallibly, but certainly not an individual. That just struck them as really not scriptural in any way, shape, or form. Are there moments of inspiration? No doubt, but that didn't seem to be one of them. Some of them became quite ossified and crystallized as rather historic pieces. So therefore there are some very small old Catholic churches, particularly in Europe, with a couple of hundred adherents, and they're happy with what they do, and they're not really seeking to change. Liberal Catholics, which would be the side of Catholicism that Antioch is on, really they have a high mystical theology, but a very, very liberal social outlook. Certainly the main liberal Catholic Church was encouraged by theosophists to put down roots in this part of the world. And without spiritualists, it would be hard to know how it would have survived at first. So we're not liberal Catholic, qua liberal Catholic. We're old Catholic in a liberal Catholic line. Our churches go right the way back to the 1st century. Some people say they go back to the apostles. In Syria, unfortunately, I can't go there at the moment because it's in Daesh territory, so I'm not really taking my life in my hands and visiting our monasteries.
Right.
But, there are stories that in one of our churches, St. Peter actually met St. Paul. Now, when you get to that sort of apocryphal material, it's very hard not to be excited and attracted. So old Catholics, stroke liberal Catholics, are those other type of Catholic which disagreed on a fundamental level with certain newly established doctrinal positions, such as infallibility. We all tend to like Mary as Queen of Heaven. We tend to find that as inspired, but I suppose we wouldn't we? But, no, when it comes down to ecclesiology, when it comes down to church governance, No, even the Bishop of Rome, even the Pope is a man, and none of the conditions, even though they've been gone over with a fine-tooth comb, can ever possibly be met existentially. So either you're left with a set of conditions that can't be met, or you're left with pronouncements that we just feel flies in the face of Christ himself. So, it may seem like a storm in a teacup. And, to me, to be honest, a lot of it is. And particularly nowadays when we've got to stand together more than ever for all sorts of reasons. But, I think to a certain extent, the attractive position of a high mystical theology, a very, very liberal social policy, and the fact you don't really have an authoritarian structure in the sense with respect to my Roman friends that they do, I think is very appealing and exciting. It certainly fits my character slightly better than Roman Catholicism. That said, I've got some great friends who are Jesuits who are supporting me and pushing me to sort of tie myself to various railings all the time. So, it's a very happy muddle. It's a very happy muddling.
This kind of reminds me of Eastern Orthodoxy. I knew an Eastern Orthodox priest one time, a father of a good friend of mine. And when I talked to him about it, there were very many similar characteristics to what you just told me. So how would you compare or contrast with the Eastern traditions that also don't believe in papal infallibility?
Well, I mean, some of our lines are actually Orthodox. The glory, the wonder of the Church of Antioch is that I'd say a third of our lines are Old Catholic, whereas a third of our lines are very easily discernible as Orthodox. We have because of the position of our monasteries in Syria and so on. Therefore, we have a very comfortable relationship with both sides. Certainly, a lot of our celebrations and possibly the way we tend to hold the Mass would be more recognizable to an Orthodox Christian than somebody, in the middle of St. Peter's Square. I mean, they'd see noticeable differences. But, we adapt. I mean, also we hold Gnostic rites, such as the Mass of Mary Magdalene, which, of course, neither side would really approve of. But let us get on with it. I think it's time to stop name-calling in religion. We've got to be more mature and think, my God, we've got all this in common. Why are we focusing on the differences, which are so minimal? And certainly we're in partial communion with Rome. We're also in partial communion with Jerusalem and Antioch, with Jerusalem and Moscow. So, I don't really see these as big issues. I think church history's a bugger at the best of times. We just got to make the best of it. I hope that answers Vance. I don't know.
No, that's good. It's such a deep subject, though. But one other thing, one of the dividing lines is the dogmatic versus the mystical. And I always thought there was mysticism hidden even in the Roman Church. What do you have to say about that?
Again, I'm not scoring points against the Romans. I mean, certainly half of the Jesuits I know would never speak to me again for a start. And I don't think there's a need to, there's genuine mysticism in the Roman Communion. There's genuine mysticism in the Anglican Communion. I mean, you could say the Anglican tradition, the Church of England, is also an old Catholic tradition. I do a lot of work locally with St. Peter's, an old arts and crafts church in Clapham, where I live. And, again, it's noticeable that they wouldn't say they're old Catholic, but it's noticeable that they are. No, I mean, Roman Catholicism at its best is this deeply resonant mystery school that seems very sadly to have been in free fall since the Second Vatican Council. I actually did my master's at Heathrow College in London, which of course was funded by Jesuits. It's impossible not to admire the Roman Church. Yes, it's done things wrong. I'm not saying that. Haven't we all? That's the human condition. But and should we forget certain types of lambasting and certain types of tyranny? No, but that's not the defining feature of any church. The Roman tradition is deep and mystical and worthy of respect. Our problem with it is we don't like that type of hierarchy, and we believe it's a little presumptuous and putting human beings in the place of the angels, which makes us very uncomfortable.
David, I'm looping back to the Valentinians. What exactly, it's more or less of a twofold question. What attracts you about Valentinianism, Gnosticism, and how does the liberal church, the liberal Catholic Church, accept it? What dogmas do they see attractive? Because obviously first thing comes to mind is the demiurge and other things that really any mainstream Christian might be resistant to.
Yeah. What has everyone got to do in life? Beware of the dogma. Valentinus should never have been thrown out of the church. I mean, yeah, are there any things called Gnostics? I mean, Elaine Pagels was very, very good. I mean, she doesn't like the term at all. Yeah, throw it out. There are different types of Christians. I think that's very important. Most of the recent scholars on Gnosticism actually are rebalancing the picture and saying, right, just because a certain group won a particular council or a debate or a bun fight doesn't necessarily mean it's got the right to say these other people don't have Christian or any other credentials. I mean, if you'd have asked, say, any of the Arians whether they were Gnostics, and some of them clearly were, they just said, no, that doesn't make any sense. If you'd have asked any of the Manichaeis, are they Gnostics? They just said, no, we're Christians. Mani thought he was an apostle of Christ in the sense that St. Paul was an apostle of Christ, neither of whom met the living Jesus, of course. So, I think name calling, kids in playgrounds and name calling, it's just deeply unhelpful. And maybe it was something, a mechanism to try and solve internal political problems in the Middle Ages. But heavens above, we've moved a long way since then, and it's time to stop doing that. There are different types and schools. I mean, if I compare Valentinus, who's clearly a Buddhist, laid back, meditating, most of the time. If I compare him to a Basilides, group sex orgies, ceremonial magic, the control of demons. I mean, what has one got to do with the other? Valentinus attracts me as a human being, and one of the books I'm planning is a vindication of his position. I mean, in the historical documents, it rather coyly says he was going to be Bishop of Rome. Yes, that means Pope. Don't try and water it down. That means Pope. And he was actually on his way to Rome when he was stabbed in the back at the end of the 2nd century. It's bad karma, bad timing. That's when money and power begins to enter the equation of church life. He got to Rome to find that his enemies had completely outmaneuvered him, and he was not going to be made pontiff. The measure of the man is that he set up a school of meditation, as we would call it nowadays, in Rome itself. He absolutely refused to back down. For him, it was all about depth prayer, meditation, discovering the spirit within. It was not about sanctified public worship, where one was given a series of dogmas and ideas that one needed to assent to. That made no sense to him at all. There's a saying in Buddhism, if you meet Buddha on the path, kill him. Now, it's a lot more difficult for a Christian to say that because the concepts are different. But at the same time, Valentinus would have approved of that saying. What is Christ in your nature may not be the same as Christ in my nature. And how, in real terms, could it be if we're all divine, if we really are the sons and daughters of God? In other words, to take away the linguistic veneers, in other words, if we are God at somewhere. Theologies come and go. I personally, right, let's take that a different way. Valentinus wrote as though he was a dualist, but a careful reading of the fragments that Valentinus wrote reveal very clearly that he's not. He's using the language of his time and the fashionable theological terminology of his time to attract an audience, to attract listeners. And why not? People do it now. Someone like Basilides would have been. Therefore, you're talking about a strange, distant type of theology from what was forging itself in Rome. And I mean in the sense of hammer and forge, not being deceitful. I don't want to accuse anybody of that. They followed their own lights. They did as they felt was correct. Whether we agree with that is a different issue, but I don't believe they were being dishonourable. even though there was a taint taking place within their fold, which they themselves didn't notice, until the end of the 3rd century, it could be argued. Valentinus liked talking about those ideas. I mean, for him, is the demiurge simply Satan? Are the three clearly already there? The mysterious three that only a Gnostic experience can actually explain, that no dogma or doctrine can ever elucidate. And the fourth is already there, Satan. He explores certain theologies, like Sophia. For him, the great goddess of nature, the archon of nature. For him, the archons weren't Anthony Peake-like archons, and that's said with love, Anthony. These are vast primal spiritual beings born of the overflow from the Bythos. The Bythos is the deep, the infinity of infinities, the ultimate divine mystery, which absolutely nothing and no one can ever even contemplate. It simply is what it is. But in some mysterious way, we are it too. And by emanation, by a series of emanations, because its nature is to overflow, it creates images of itself down the various chains of being until it reaches the level before the material universe, which takes the form of Sophia. Sophia is so in awe of this father-mother being at the top of the great ladder of creation, she tries to emulate it. She can't do it. She is divine, but she's still not the Bythos. So the natural order, the material world that she gives birth to, has a defect and a flaw from the beginning. You'll notice this is very different from most concepts of demiurgery and the fact there is a tainted presence literally poisoning this universe. Certainly, if we look at Plotinus, he also would have attacked the Gnostics on that, most of them. Saying, no, how can anybody say this is a poisonous world? Of course it's not. It has its flaws, it has its errors, but certainly it's not evil. We would know if it was evil. And, I suppose Valentinus was much more on those lines. And certainly, if you said to Valentinus, those are wonderful theological stories, are they true? He'd have said, go and meditate. He wouldn't have said yes, he wouldn't have said no. He'd have said, try and find that voice within you that will answer you. The minute dogma and theology become a series of principles that need our assent, any church, any religion goes wrong. It's all within us, and that's how and why Valentinus attracts me most of all.
That's funny because we were just talking to our webmaster. I was sending an email to her, and I quoted that famous song, "Who Let the Dog Out?"
Yeah.
I love Valentinus.
What does I say? Beware of the dogma. It's at the front of every building. You've got to be careful.
So could you say Valentinus was one of the only Gnostic forefathers that I know of that actually had some love for the demiurge as opposed to just denouncing it as total evil and should be banished and so forth?
Well, I mean, you're looking at a mind of extreme sophistication. Like, did he actually believe there was an entity called the demiurge? There's a question. Do Buddhists actually believe there is a Mara? Who, of course, I mean, the irony in Buddhism is Mara's the creative one. Without Mara, there are no universes. So, there's something of an irony behind the concept of a demiurge. Valentinus wouldn't have denied it, but I get the impression, remember, only fragments are left. From the fragments that are left, he'd prefer, rather like Buddha, not to talk about it. As Buddha would have said, a sick man doesn't need a class in philosophy. A sick man needs a doctor. And that would have been Valentinus's view as well. Why are you asking these questions? And your your life of meditation, your meditational practice is so weak. So, he'd have probably discussed the ideas, the stories. But I always get the impression with him that they're more like Buddhist teaching stories than actual points of doctrine one needs to assent to. And I'm saying that because he always seems to me to be so critical of other Gnostic teachers that are doing that. Valentinus would have said he was in the mystery school of St. Paul, and he would have claimed that all he's actually doing is continuing the teaching that his teacher would have got directly from St. Paul, his teacher's teaching. Therefore, he couldn't see why the church was so absolutely determined to throw him out. and thereby hangs another tale, of course, which is why this book needs to be written. You know, they threw out the baby with the bathwater for all sorts of reasons at the end of the 2nd century. It's time for all of us to reassess and go back and think, why did it happen? And in many ways, should some of those people ever have been thrown out because of a different type of practice? So that's, you know, sort of where I'm coming from.
Well said, David. And I think also what separates Valentinus, even in those days, from Christianity, perhaps other Gnostic groups, is Valentinus really promoted the idea of love pretty much more than anybody. Do you agree with that, David?
Oh, I mean, look, as I was saying, you know, what attracts me to the Antioch people? You've got this high mystical theology there, but a really, really open, loving, tolerant, liberal policy. I mean, that's Valentinus, isn't it? You know, love is the message. The message is love. The minute a Christian church wasn't doing that, he was on them like a ton of bricks. But that strikes me as incredibly Christian. You know, I mean, I always had the image when, because I got into Gnosticism as an idea in a very primitive way, I suppose, looking back as a teenager. You know, it's been the common denominator in all of my searchings. You know, anyone that can't ascend, yeah, no, right, take that a different way. I'm British, so I like cricket. You can all shout at me now. And, you know, cricket's an absolutely wonderful game. You know, and what's the secret of cricket, my dear friends across the pond? You go into the pavilion, you have endless pink gins, and then nobody's bothered who's on the field. And you just throw balls around. It's a lovely, lovely game. You know, there was a very famous Victorian cricketer called W.G. Grace, who got incredibly drunk at Lord's one night, jumped on a table, and he was quite a scholar, by the way. Heads, any old cabbage has a head. What God wants is a heart. You know, right, so that's Valentinus. That's exactly what he would have thought. You know, and he could demonstrate it scripturally. Don't have a blazing argument with your brothers and sisters and all be taking mass the next morning when you're refusing to do business with them, when you're not speaking to them, when you're lying about them at the back of the church. Make peace. Show love. That's what Christianity is about. Balancing the inner life and trying harder.
Well said. I certainly agree with that. And also another concept I love about Valentinus was the idea of I think he was the first one, or one of the first ones in Christianity, to really promote the idea of the guardian angel, which of course we know from our mutual friend Anthony Peake was the daemon. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about Valentinus and his idea of our guardian angel?
Well, I mean, it goes back directly to the Greek idea of the daimon. I mean, I'm not sure why or how. I do a radio show called THA Talks with Paul Obertelli. Paul Obertelli's the conspiracy boy. I'm not. You know, I'm sorry, I just don't believe most of them. Financial conspiracies, yes, I can see that happening in front of me, but not some of the others. Oh God, this is a huge question. In terms of, that's a big question. You've got to boil it down for me a bit, Miguel.
Well, I always like the idea that Christ breaks himself into little sparks that watch over us and sort of guide us to individuation or the pleroma or whatever you want to call it.
Right. All you Gnostics out there, don't jump on me. Miguel's just asked me a grossly unfair question, which could take a year to answer. Daimons. It's really unwise to think our ancestors were sort of, wiping their rears with leaves and throwing rocks at each other. I mean, the civilizations of the past tended to be much more sophisticated about internal mechanics than we are. We externalize mechanisms and we explore them through technology, through material sciences, and there's nothing wrong with that. But our ancestors, because of all sorts of cultural and temporal reasons, it could be argued we're doing it internally. Therefore, maybe psychology is actually one of the original sciences, not actually one of the newest. Certainly, I always get the impression, the minute we're talking about guardian angels, a myth can be taken on so many levels, can't it? Some people would think it's an actuality. There are entities. There's a good angel at my right shoulder, a bad angel at my left shoulder, and who knows, perhaps they're right. But I suspect the likes of Valentinus would have thought more that that's a symbol of higher consciousness, of super consciousness, as indeed would the daimon have been. I mean, the daimon of Socrates. You know, it was Kierkegaard's wonderful question, what is the difference between Socrates and Jesus? But actually that's, you know, because of the source of the question, actually a trickier question than it looked. Socrates was a moral teacher. Jesus was a moral teacher. Socrates got messages from his daimon about supernatural realities. Jesus Christ got them from the spirit. So that's actually quite a complex question. You know, and for Kierkegaard, it would have come down to the fact that actually Jesus is the Son of God. That, you know, that's the difference. And I don't think Valentinus would have denied that. I mean, that would have made him a very odd Christian, not necessarily a heretic. I don't like the word heretic. It means nothing. You know, it means I disagree with you. That's all that word means.
Right, to make a choice in Greek.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm right. I've got the church money. You're wrong. You don't have the church money. You're a heretic. Get out of this building. You know, name calling, children's games, name calling. I get the impression that Valentinus would have thought a guardian angel, a daimon, a spiritual entity of that sort, was actually a way of talking about the higher levels of consciousness within ourselves. I mean, this isn't what he said because it's in none of the fragments. It's a suggestion, I think, which is there, that a human being actually has many bodies, some of which are much more subtle than others. Therefore, we have a body on every single level of existence. Or at least we have aspects of consciousness on every level of existence, some of which take a downward path because we're also animals, some of which take an upward path into the heavens beyond, you know, into the homo superior, whatever comes next. And therefore you start talking about higher consciousness. Of course, alternative states of consciousness are not by definition higher states of consciousness. They're alternatives. So therefore, when the ancients were talking about those things, they were talking about higher, more organized, creative, insightful types of consciousness, which eventually, along Jacob's ladder, that is one of the things that's mentioned, becomes a cosmic or godlike level of consciousness. And so I suspect when he's talking about good angels, which he talks about a great deal, there's actually a deep implication, again, for one's meditation practice. Valentinus always drags teaching back to practice. You know, are you certain in terms of meditation that this is actually what you're thinking, actually what you're feeling, which is why it's so exciting. And a real challenge. This is an age of knowledge, not an age of faith. And the challenge is, yes, there is just a stronger body of knowledge, a body of ideas, body of theories in spirituality as in the sciences, which is where I think Gnosticism, particularly in our time, stands so firm.
I've always had this sneaking suspicion, even though I know Saint Valentine of the Catholic Church, you know, Roman Catholic Church was a martyr and this and that, but little is known of him. Do you think it's possible that some Gnostics at some sort of, you know, in some place, maybe even Chaucer in the Middle Ages, actually instituted the holiday of Saint Valentine's Day to honor Valentinus himself, as opposed to the more cryptic and unknown character of quote unquote Saint Valentine?
An interesting thought. I mean, certainly those are rumors, aren't they? Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And I like St. Valentine. I mean, apparently he was a really short guy with a foul temper who could never reach the altar and was caught swearing at various people. Remember, there's more than one Valentine. Was caught swearing at various people when he couldn't get to the altar to marry them because he actually couldn't lay his hands on them properly. You know, there's the Roman guy who's meant to have been arrested for marrying people under one of the Caesars when Christians weren't allowed to be married. You know, I mean, these composite figures are more than one historical person. There are a number of persona melded into one, which is why theories like that arise. You know, was it really a way of talking about a type of theology? Certainly, I don't think these things ever truly disappeared from the church. Otherwise, you wouldn't get internal crusades in Europe. The Albigensians, for instance, they were seen as an actual threat. You know, those military actions took place because it was considered a living, vital reality that they wanted to to purge, to expunge from the Catholic Church as it was then. And I'm not attacking Catholicism. No, I don't believe it, because I think they were... Love is the message, and certainly the short guy and the Roman guy would have agreed with that, and they tied it in with, of course, the rites of marriage. There simply isn't enough evidence, and I suppose the Gnostic bit of me would say, well, I can't really even find internal evidence for that, let alone historical evidence. I'd like to believe that. I think it's a wonderful story. Let's hope it's true, but at this moment in time, I don't go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can accept that, but you know what? I think of all those characters, I think Valentinus truly embodies the spirit of St. Valentine's Day.
Yeah. Oh, if ever there was a Saint Valentine, it was him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
You know, all these endless love feasts. You know, I mean, that can't be just swept away. What a great encouragement to us all. You know, let's try and genuinely make peace and love each other. That message was revolutionary then, and to our shame and detriment, it's still revolutionary now. You know, what an incredible guy he was.
Well said, and certainly agree. You are preaching to the choir, and I think the audience would agree too. Yes.
You bet. You
oh,
bet.
God,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Am I acting like a priest today? Well, it is Sunday. I'm sorry.
Well, as long as you can reach to lay your hands on us, we'll be fine. You're that short, but your words, very tall words. I like them, David. And we were discussing love. What would you say would be the Valentinian approach to Gnosis and faith, or perhaps what is your approach to it?
The type of Gnosticism I'm involved with, and my own personal approach to Gnosis, makes room for faith. There's nothing wrong with faith. People have such hard lives. Ideas have power. You know, it's better to be a person that's grown up in an ideological system where tolerance and peace and love is encouraged than not. I've dealt with the Muslim world for over 25 years. I don't feel threatened by them in the least. Some of them are very close friends of mine, particularly Central Asia, where I do a lot of work. They're sweet, charming, beautiful people. You know, but rather like Christianity, there are areas of Islam which don't grow up in that thought atmosphere. You know, are you respecting your neighbor? Are you honoring the person of the book? Are you showing them friendship or compassion? Therefore, I think even faith, God, that sounds awfully reductive, doesn't it? Even situations, milieu of faith are important. What ideas are you bringing your children up within? You know, what intellectual atmosphere is pervading your home? Therefore, faith has a place, and most people, sadly, I think, will not take the Gnostic quest. You know, something I used to like the works of Alice Bailey. I don't know what I think of them nowadays. I think they're still very impressive. And yes, there is an occultist buried in me somewhere. I confess to that. You know, I mean, I had terrible trouble with her view that everybody's at a different level of evolution. And certainly that's a Valentinian thought. You know, and you just have to accept that. That is what the world is like. You have to live with that. You have to grapple with that. Do you want to change the world into a temple? My answer is yes, but the point is I'm not going to get the chance. So, you know, faith has a very, very important function on a cultural and social, dare I say, political level, because it's to do with the ideological atmosphere, as I say, that people are maturing in, that they're raising their families in, that they're sharing with their grandchildren. But for me, that's more like sort of an exam that the entire human race has been given. You know, this is the paperwork. You've now got a series of multiple choice questions. Can you answer them? Therefore, for me, if you remain a member of the faithful, you have flunked the test. You got an F grade. If you suddenly start thinking about your religion, you know, your spirituality, you know, the meaning of your life. You know, why get up in the morning? You know, why battle with the world? Why go to work? Why raise a family? Oh my God, they all hate me anyway. And my neighbors are even worse. You know, why? Why do that? Yeah, religion for me isn't a series of pat answers, or it's not a series of cozy responses to make life slightly better as we crawl our way through it. I just don't believe that. Religion grew out of a series of existential crises, of existential questionings about life itself. Why am I here? What am I doing here? Where am I going? Faith, the atmosphere, the ideological atmosphere of faith, is one of those temporary solutions. It allows us to orient ourselves within a particular culture, within a particular historical stream, and make more sense of our life than we would have done without it. But for me, the next step is Gnosis. Okay, some of those things have given me a map. What is faith? It's a mappa mundi. It's a mappa mundi. It's given me a map of a certain type of culture and civilization. But how did it arise? Why did those things start in the first place? And that's the beginning of the Gnostic quest. Why is it important to take that next step? Because you are more than just a father or a son or a teacher or an accountant. You are a child of the Bythos. Your destiny is amongst the stars. You are one of the hands and eyes of the Spirit. And you can choose not to embrace that in your life, which is a shame. Or you can start a journey whereby you think, my God, there's so much more to me than meets the eye, and I want to share that with the people around me. In terms of the Antioch people, they're very aware of what I think. I've no intention of changing that. We were getting on rather spiffingly until a couple of months ago, when I wanted assurances that, we evil Gnostics, that joining the church will be allowed the authenticity of our own practice. At that time, we didn't get any answers directly. I imagine they were thinking about it prayerfully themselves. Therefore, everything was put on hold, if I'm completely honest with you. And we said, well, as a tiny group, we can't go any further. We need some answers. They got back to us a couple of weeks ago and said, yes, you are as you are. We accept your search. We accept your journey. And that's why we're actually making history at the moment. You could say, on a metaphorical level, Valentinus, after all these centuries, is finally being welcomed back into the mainstream church. And we're doing it, as I say, I'm a Catholic with a Gnostic theology. Where do we go from there? I don't know, but it's exciting territory to be in.
It is indeed, and it is very good news. The next question would be, David, we were talking about Valentinus, his ideas, his theology, and so forth. But what about putting it in practice? I mean, you talked about meditation. We do know that the Valentinian church was sacramental. In a modern context, for the audience, what are some meditative exercises or rituals do you recommend, or do you see, or do you propose or practice? Obviously, these are going to be reconstructions. We don't have much about Valentinus or the ancient Gnostics, maybe the Gospel of Philip and a few others.
Gosh, again, that's another deep question, Miguel. I've got to be careful. I start dropping people. No, don't stop this. I just hope I'm not being too much of a preach and I'm boring you all to death. That's worrying me a bit.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Well,
not me.
You've got to promise, boys. I'll know at the end if you say thank you. That was a nice interview. By the way, you're never hearing from us again. So I will know. Be careful.
That won't happen. No worries.
Well, look, I mean, believe it or not, I actually hold a monthly meditation circle at St. Peter's, the Anglican Church. Our practice tends to be rather Quakerish. We tend to meditate in the silence. Now, in a city, we're all in cities. I think this show comes from Chicago. The one thing you never get big city nowadays is silence and stillness. And, there's something intoxicating in silence and stillness in the middle of London. So we practice meditation techniques like that. I'm starting, believe it or not, a spoken word and meditation circle. We're slightly revamping it next month. But that's been going for some time now. We cover reflective via negativa meditation, where you just look, you listen to the voices as they go through your head, focusing on the breath, looking at the images and letting them pass through you, trying to get to the core of yourself. We also practice visualization meditations, path workings, similar to St. Ignatius, or indeed the Wiccans. They do things like that. But we're in the wonderful position, of course, of also being able to have a sacramental service. Therefore, we hold Mass, we hold communion. We have most of the offices of the church. We draw heavily on the science of the sacraments by Ledbetter. I sometimes get drawn into the type of worship that some people describe as theurgy. It is not something that should be played with, because at the end of the day, who is the priest, who is the magician experimenting with themselves, their own minds and their own bodies? So it's not something to launch into lightly. But certainly I would claim that that is a type of worship, and that is actually an extension of the type of prayer life that I'm talking about. You know, prayer is the missing element in all of this. Prayer can be petitionary. There's a great guy I admire in America. I bet he'd hate me. Chuck Missler. I think he's an absolutely astonishing guy. And that man knows his Bible backwards. I don't think he likes Gnostics. You know, and the Bible Belt, for me, it represents so many good things, but then you get to a brick wall. You know, it simply won't engage. Why am I mentioning him? Because there's no way we can actually say to people like that, and I'm saying that with respect to Dr. Missler, that, you know, would you countenance theurgical practice as prayer? He'd say, of course not. But I notice his version of prayer is really quite denuded. I mean, when I've seen him only on YouTube, sadly, open one of his normally incredibly clever lectures, they all say a few moments of prayer. So in other words, prayer is only mumbling words and then lifting your head up and everything's great. And so you're in harmony with the universe. Is that they think thoughts in the head are sort of the whole thing. You know, you think in a particular way, therefore you are saved. My heavens. But okay, what if you're a Muslim who says that? What if you're a Palestinian terrorist? And they're not all terrorists. Wahhabi Muslim, you know, so it's the thoughts in their heads that save them. No. Practice and prayer must also be personalist. They must be expressed existentially through ritual, through visualization, as I was saying before, through actions. You know, prayer is actually a nexus of things. It's a body of things. Petitionary prayer is one of them, but there's so much more to it than that. And of course, the uncharitable have called that magic. I would call it theurgy, which of course actually does mean a type of worship. What am I saying to the guy in the street with a busy life and too many bills and a girlfriend that's constantly arguing with him? I'm not saying become a Gnostic priest unless you feel you're being drawn in that direction. What I am saying is maybe take things at the nice and simplest. You know, what do the angels want? They want us starting where we are. They don't want us starting where we can't be. Make a few minutes for yourself, you know, maybe once a week, half an hour, you know, just being quiet and still and thinking, I'm a human being, and by the way, I'm quite okay. I'm not a swine. You know, try and cultivate, encourage those moral, deeply inbuilt virtues and values in yourself. You know, either we're the children of God or we're not. And if we are, then goodness and beauty and truth naturally live inside us. And if they do, the main failure of our society at the moment, even in churches, is to never make time to just allow those virtues to come out. You know, I can see someone who's beautiful. That's lifted up my day. I heard somebody say sorry for telling a lie. That's lifted up my day. You know, just make half an hour, 10 minutes a week to remember your inner core, which is beautiful and good and true. And that's what I recommend to any guy, any girl who's having a difficult time, you know, where the boss is shouting at them. And, you know, who knows where that journey will eventually take them. Was that a good enough answer? Was that me rambling, Miguel?
That was a wonderful answer. Definitely a good way to live life. And I agree. And I do try to do these things in my limited capacities. But we're speaking about life, David. Tell us a little bit about death. How does Valentinus approach death, and what are your views on death and the afterlife?
There is no death, he said cryptically. Oh gosh. I think
is this another big question? One more of my spanning questions, broad questions.
Well, I mean, you know, David, what do you think of life and death? I think that's a big yes. I think that's a big yes. So it's a good question. Don't get me wrong. Oh gosh. I'm beginning to warm to the idea of reincarnation, which certain Christians at the very beginning did agree with, of course. There was a wonderful book years back called Death and Eternal Life, written by John Hitt, who was a professor of comparative theology, I think, at the University of London. I can't remember if it was London or somewhere else. And he goes through all the various theories from different times and different cultures, looking at what different societies, cultures have felt and thought. Curiously, there does seem to be a common denominator. My own personal view is that consciousness should expand and be a function of the body. No, I don't believe that. It's not simply a product of the brain. Even if it is, and the arguments certainly don't go in that direction, then, where is your eternity? Where is your afterlife? In every moment of love, in every handshake, in every time you've done the good thing instead of the bad thing. So there's a secular immortality. But I actually do believe there's a supernatural. And I would make the audacious claim I've had certain experiences of that from time to time. That's where you can all jump on me properly. No, consciousness expands. There's no end to consciousness. In that, I suppose I'm sort of a surrogate Hindu. The more our consciousness expands, the more it becomes other things when our present physical form gets weak and eventually passes. Do I think people suddenly sprout wings and pop into the third heaven? I don't know. But I do think consciousness continues to exist. And I think it takes different forms and different shapes, maybe literally. But the point is for its journey of expansion to continue. That's how I would see a continuity beyond physical death, beyond mortality. I don't think it's clear what Valentinus thought at all. Certainly because, he divides people into three types of person, and again, it's uncharitable. Some of the interpretations that have been given to his view, they say he talked about beast people, human beast, and they were sort of Joe Blow, the average guy who was just driven by complexes and traumas and anxieties and was violent and unreflective, and all he wanted was sex and pleasure and booze. And that doesn't strike me as a man that talks about love all the time. I bet there's a whole raft of material around that subject that's gone missing and been deliberately destroyed. Next, according to some of the recorded teachings of Valentinus, there's a guy that's sort of saved who'd be a normal Christian, but the real McCoy is anyone that surrounds, Valentinus, or anyone that absorbs his teaching. That's the real Gnostic. That's the real Christian. But again, I get the impression those are fragments of a much larger body of thought, which I think probably would have been much more radical than his opponents wanted us to realize. We've got to remember most of his work, 99% of his work, survives through quotes in other people's commentaries where they're answering a particular question. It's debatable whether there are other works or not. I'm not a scholar. I know they're there, and I know some people who are working with them. But I'm not a scholar, so I don't know if they're authenticated. I don't know how you authenticate things like that anyway. In real terms, when they've gone through so many other hands and there's no clear paper trail of their existence, yada, 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 yada. So for me, I don't think I could answer his view. I suspect it was a lot more generous than people are saying, whereby even maybe the beastmen would have been reincarnated. I've got that deep personal suspicion. For me, it reads like a ladder of ascent. We are where we are at a particular time, in a particular lifetime, a particular incarnation, but we ascend the ladder as we go along. Now, whether he means in a particular lifetime or more than one lifetime in a Hindu or Buddhist sense, I can't prove. But as I say, for me personally, I suspect because of all the stuff he wrote on love, all the sayings, all the practices, I think you're looking at something more like that.
Yes, and it should be mentioned too, David. I have interviewed many scholars on Valentinus. Some are, like Einar Thomason, are the translators of the Nag Hammadi library. And they would say it's very hard to find an agreement with all the Valentinians, because there were different schools, and as you say, it was a speculative sort of movement where people just speculated, did their exercises, had their experiences. And again, as you say, there was no central dogma. So I think that's the beauty about the Valentinian school, and you're certainly part of it. Do you have a question, Vance?
Yes, this kind of goes from the sublime to the mundane, but I've always had a little bit of a problem with the concept of priests, I guess being brought up in the Catholic. And so when I hear Gnostic priest, it's almost like an oxymoron, you know, it's like, here's this priest that's trying to stand between me and God, but I'm a Gnostic. So, you know, God is with me and the monad and all that type of thing. I'd love to hear your take on it.
Get to church, young man. That's what I say. Right. I mean, as Thomas Hardy said, I'm just a humble preacher, man. The Nag Hammadi collection, Jung's commentaries on the Nag Hammadi, comments, thoughts. What was that incredible scholar that wrote, a Jungian scholar that made such an in-depth study of the Gnostics? His name completely escapes me at the minute.
You're talking about June Singer?
No, I mean, what a wonderful scholar. There was somebody else, a sort of rather august gentleman. Anyway, the name will come to me.
Perhaps?
Maybe. No, I've got his head in my head. I can't remember his name at the minute. It will return. I mean, I'm not talking in the way they're talking about those texts. The image that struck me that came from those texts is of a Gnostic priest in the early centuries who would have been something more akin to a religious professional or someone like a coach. I mean, there would be a priest or indeed a priestess, holding maybe a scripture at the front of a group of people meditating or praying and read the scripture. Someone who would have been designated to hold the rites of passage. Is that saying nobody else should do it? No, but I rather think that like any other profession, there tends to be people with a particular type of calling. I can see, obviously, because I'm one of them, room for a religious professional like a yoga teacher or a prayer teacher. And I would tend to think of a Gnostic priest or priestess along those lines. Therefore, they would be the person to approach to encourage you to take these further steps as opposed to stand in the way. That, to me, strikes me more like traditional mainstream clergy who don't want you to think too much about anything in particular. And you'll go to hell if you don't do what Nanny says. No. By definition, a Gnostic minister, a Gnostic priest, a Gnostic priestess is the person who's facilitating your journey. When you get stuck, when you're going in circles, more akin to a sort of counselor or psychologist, I suppose. Maybe those two professions grew out of the Gnostic priesthood. Who knows? But I tend to see it that way, and therefore I can see a place for a loose clergy and a loose hierarchy, but not even. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Russian Orthodoxy, but my problem with them too would be the rigid hierarchy. I suspect, there are people in certain existential places, in karmic places in life, and that's how you know what their sort of vocation is, if that's not too pretentious a word. But no, I can see a function with that. I don't see it as an oxymoron, even though we're all the monad, we're all the monads. Yes, I accept that.
I think that's all the time we have today, David. First, Vance, thanks for joining us.
Very good, Miguel. It was a pleasure to be here and great to meet you, David.
David, thank you very much for coming on AM Byte and giving us a remarkable exposition on Valentinus, modern Gnosticism, and a lot of other very good topics.
It's been a singular pleasure. I admire your work.
Thank you.
And, it's a wonderful show, and I'm very honored to be invited. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's overdue, but we're glad you're here. And again, we look forward to having you back.
Thank you. Thank you, Miguel.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers, the first part of our interview with David Parry. And things get even more thought-provoking and elegantly mystic in our second part, where David delves into both the mechanics and metaphysics of Gnostic priesthood, including how they approach the sacraments. He'll also grant his views and some history on alchemy, sacred theater, the relationship between art and magic, an esoteric view of the apocalypse and the book of Revelation, and more. Yes, this will be for members, so please join for a mere $5.99 a lunar cycle. It's a mere pittance. Beyond full interviews, you'll get more than 350 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoteric, and free thought. You'll also be invited to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where David will be there to answer your questions in our usual Q&A session. And we have some remarkable discussions, and past guests hang out there too, like Tim Freak, Robert Price, Steve D, Scott Smith, and David Curtis. And I'm always there to answer your questions or issues too. We are truly building a game-changing community of mystics, madmen, and sages. And the Archons shiver in their knickers. Of course, if you've got holes in your pocket, just let me know, and I'll be glad to send you any of the complete shows. Becoming a member really helps keep this Red Pill Cafeteria open. You can also become a patron at Patreon, where you get some of the same benefits. Or maybe a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail. You can always help me by buying some of me books, like Voices of Gnosticism, Other Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, and Heretic. I can't do it without you, in more ways than one. All forms of support are found at, you got it, thegodabovegod.com. Thank you so much for being here. It is my hope that I and our astral guests have helped you find the mysteries that work for you and only you. Get you a little bit closer to embodying the poetic, elegant, and mystic tenor of Valentinus, and becoming the hero or heroine you always deserve to be. Hello and goodbye as always.